from the studios of Clean Fuels Alliance America, this is the Better, Cleaner, Now podcast. Authentic conversations with leaders in the biodiesel, renewable diesel, and sustainable aviation fuel industries. Now, here's your host, Scott Tremaine.
And welcome. On this week's episode, Clean Fuels Vice President Federal Affairs Kurt Kovarik sits down with the former senator from North Dakota, Byron Dorgan.
All right. Thank you, Scott. I'm excited to have Senator Byron Dorgan. Byron, thanks for taking the time to join me on today's podcast.
Glad to be here.
Well, let's get right into it. For those listeners who aren't familiar with your time in the Senate, maybe give us a quick overview. You were first elected when? 1970?
I was elected in 1980 to the U.S. House of Representatives. I spent 12 years there. I was on the House Ways and Means Committee, among other things, and then I was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1992, and I served 18 years in the Senate.
Okay.
So I served 30 years total, and decided at that point it was probably time for me to do some other things, and made that judgment.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your time there in the Senate with respect to your committee assignments. I remember you very involved in the Indian Affairs Committee, Democratic Policy Committee. I also recall the first time that I think I met you personally was in Senator Grassi's office when you were doing oversight work on contracts in Iraq through the Pentagon. When you look back at your time in Congress and your role and the committees that you were involved in, what would you say are some of your kind of biggest achievements or the greatest moments that you're proud of when you look back on your career in the Senate?
Well, I come from a small farming community in North Dakota. We raised some horses and some cattle, a town of 300 people. And you've probably heard me say a high school senior class of 9 students. I was in the top 5.
Well done.
And that's right. That allows me to be in the Congress, at least, to be in the top 5. But, so I was interested. I joined the Agriculture Committee in the House first, and then went to the Ways and Means Committee. But I was very interested in agriculture, very, very interested in energy issues. I come from a state where there's a great deal of oil production, but we're also the Saudi Arabia of wind.
Absolutely.
So I was very interested in wind energy and solar energy. But then I became very interested early on, and even before I came to the Congress, in the issue of what was called back then gasohol. You remember?
Absolutely, yes.
And ethanol,
absolutely.
And the biofuels, and what that could be and what it would mean. And I remember the day that Pete Domenici and I, working together with George W. Bush,
Yep.
We announced, I think it was a 36 billion gallon target with,
Yep.
with ethanol and cellulosic,
Yep.
18 billion gallons of cellulosic. Well, but that all happened because we were importing so much energy, so much oil. And so, we wanted to have more produced here, and also the issue of diversity of fuels. And now, going down the roadways, we discover not only do we have more diversity and reductions now in carbon, but this can be a very significant part of the issue of dealing with climate change.
Yeah, you remind me of a very important point there when George W. Bush led the effort on the renewable fuel standard. I mean, an oil man from Texas, and you're exactly right. It was because of energy security. At that time, we were probably importing more than half of our petroleum, probably approaching 60%, if I recall right. When did the shale oil boom take off in North Dakota? Was that after you had left the Senate when they
No, it was
before?
No, in fact, I was able to get the U.S. Geological Survey to do the survey
Okay.
of that, and they came out with I think it was several billion potential gallons of oil in the Bakken Shale. But the Bakken Shale was, and I should tell your audience that I was chairman of the committee, the Appropriations Committee, that funded the Geological Survey.
Okay.
Well, that's the way you get something done earlier than it otherwise would have been done, to come in and evaluate what kind of oil reserves might be there underground. 2 miles down, 150 foot thick, that's the Bakken Shale. And it turns out North Dakota is producing right now about 1.2 million barrels a day. Think of it. So, just as George W. Bush came from an oil background, I came from a state that produces a substantial amount of oil, not as much then as it does now, but it's pretty remarkable. And so, coming from a farm background and, understanding agriculture and energy, that was something I did a lot in the Congress.
Well, that's a great perspective, given the wind resources, the oil and gas resources, but then also the agriculture. I mean, rich agricultural state. There's probably no state in the union that's quite situated like North Dakota in terms of all of the energy potential that can be produced there.
We virtually do it all, really. And, you would brag about Iowa as being probably better, but
I would.
Yeah. But we can produce substantial amounts of fuel, oil and gas, and we can produce a substantial amount of fuel now from plant-based materials, and I became very interested. I held the first meeting in Grand Forks, North Dakota, on wind energy, and I think I had 700 people show up. I mean, unbelievable. We are the Saudi Arabia of wind. We're born leaning to the northwest because of that Canadian wind, and so we have the great capacity to do that. And the agriculture community, the farmers in North Dakota, have been enormously blessed by being able to see different markets and additional markets as a result of what they do.
Yeah. When you think back to the mid-2000s, creation of the renewable fuel standard, bipartisan product, you had buy-in from, George W. Bush, Senator Domenici from New Mexico. Is anything like that achievable today in your mind? Is there any conceivable way that the Congress or the president as it exists today, not necessarily the ones that we have in the office today, but just the environment, the atmosphere? Do you think there's any way that RFS could be created in this environment?
It's much more difficult now than it was. Some people don't want the federal government to demand anything, to force anything, to require anything. They say, no, we don't want there to be any requirement. The renewable fuel standard, the RFS, was a requirement. And the fact is, it was Republican and Democrat. We worked together on a bipartisan basis to pass that legislation. And, some didn't like it. But the fact is, it was good for our country. And you were right about, we were close to 60% imports of oil in order to sustain this, this major American economy that we have.
It was a national security issue.
And that it sure was. And we had to decide, what more can we do? Well, one of the things we could do is produce more energy here at home, and a different kind of energy, not necessarily petroleum, but energy that comes from plants and other things. And so, this was a big success, I thought. I was proud to be a part of it. And, I mentioned Senator Domenici and George W. and others. And, now we have, Senator Grassley and so many others in the Congress that have been strong leaders and supporters on these issues.
Absolutely. So as you look at the current political climate, we've got a new Speaker of the House who's got 219 members in the majority. That's not that's not a big margin. That's a majority of one, essentially. A nearly divided Senate. We've seen. I think of my time in the Senate and going back to 2010 with kind of the evolution of the Tea Party movement as perhaps maybe the first big wave of folks who were just, their answer to everything really is no. And there's a growing contingent of folks. But as you look at the current climate now, how do you envision getting, aside from using the budget reconciliation process, maybe on something like the Inflation Reduction Act? We've got all of these big items that need to be addressed here in 2024 with appropriations to fund the government, a farm bill, modifications to the Inflation Reduction Act. How do you see any coalitions of folks coming together? Immigration. I know you follow all of these different policy areas. What's your view on what it's going to take to get big things done to address some of these problems for the country?
Actually, the Senate is beginning to do that, and Senator Lankford, Senator Murphy, and others have been working very hard to put together a bill. And, we'll see whether it gets done, but, there's great concern by people in this country about compromise. The lubrication of democracy has always been the ability to compromise. People feel differently, so you figure out, all right, how can we make some progress here? And yet, I can remember when the Tea Party started, I remember, a whole lot of folks were running for the House and the Senate, and they were saying to their town meetings out there, they would say this: I'll tell you what, these are my values. And when I come back for re-election, you take a look at this and you say, did he stick by his values or did he compromise? And if I compromise, fire me.
That's
because I don't intend to compromise a bit.
And that's when the word compromise became a bad word.
Absolutely. It became a 4-letter word. And,
yes.
And so, but most of us understand the ability to compromise at the right time in the right way is the way you move things forward. I just was looking at these. Immigration you mentioned as an issue. Climate change is a big issue. The issue of abortion and reproductive freedom, the issue these days of some funds for Ukraine to deal with what Putin is doing in Ukraine, with
yes.
some funds for Israel, the issue of government spending or a potential debt default. All of those are big, big issues that have significant consequences, and yet it is very hard on any of these issues to find a way to compromise between Republicans and Democrats, because some believe compromise is fundamentally wrong.
Do we have the leaders in place to get those deals done? I mean, in past years, if you had a strong leader who brought the right people to the table and said, here's the deal, it just doesn't feel to me like we have any of the leaders who have that ability with rank and file anymore.
Well, and whoever the leaders are, they have almost no margin at all.
That's right.
The House has a vote or two, and maybe not even that with Manchin and Sinema. So, that's the Senate. And the House, you've got a rookie speaker. I'm just staggered that this guy is a Speaker of the House.
Yeah.
And we'll see what he means and what he says and what he does. But at least from an early standpoint here, I am most unimpressed.
Yeah. You brought up Manchin, so that's fair game. Is he running for president?
Don't know. He's obviously not told us that he's not going to run, but I hope he's not. I really think that what some people are doing, some people that I know well, to try to put together this new group, I hope they fail. I mean, at this point, I think there's very substantial risk. I'm speaking now from my perspective as a Democrat. I obviously have not voted for Donald Trump and don't have great respect for the Trump presidency or potential presidency now going forward. And so I think there's great risk that Donald Trump could become president once again. And so my feeling is I want, there to be a race between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, I guess, if that's what we're going to have, and then have a selection that moves us in a different direction.
Yeah.
And let me also say, just for a moment, we could talk about this, the issue of President Biden, who I think has done an extraordinary job in many ways, but that does not add up to what he's been able to do or should have done on biofuels. They've done some things. Donald Trump hurt us. He didn't help us much.
That's right.
And this White House, I'm a Democrat. I'm a friend of Joe's. But the fact is, they could do much, much more than they're doing for biofuels, and I want them to.
If you were sitting in the Oval Office and the president said to you, Senator Dorgan, what can I do that I haven't been doing for biofuels? What would you tell him? What would be your arguments as to why he should be doing more?
Well, they could weigh in on a number of things. We want biofuels to be a significant part of the fuel structure for planes and trains and those that are sea vessels. And we've got a tremendous new market out there if we get some changes made to do that. And this White House could do that easily. I want this White House to see biofuels as a significant part of their future. They're talking about solar, and good for them. Lots of new solar, a lot of new wind, good for them. I want them to understand there's also a need for a lot of new biofuel production, because that also dramatically reduces carbon.
You're listening to the Better, Cleaner, Now podcast.
I'm Kurt Kovarik, Vice President of Federal Affairs for Clean Fuels Alliance America, and today we're speaking with former Senator Byron Dorgan. We're just talking a little bit about the Biden administration and their climate goals and how biofuels fits into that. Obviously, there's a lot of momentum around electric vehicles, and I think with the Biden administration's kind of signature legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of tax incentives, but a lot of programs primarily focused on electrification, which is okay. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with trying to move technologies forward, particularly on electrification. But I think from the biofuels perspective, it's a frustration for us that the benefits that we're offering right now in terms of carbon reduction of 75% on average drop in today, and those greenhouse gases that are never emitted is kind of lost on this administration to some extent. We know we've got a big champion in Secretary Vilsack who carries that message to the administration, but for the most part, it feels like biofuels and biodiesel is something they kind of deal with when they have to, but it's not really their priority. With the shrinking number of Democrats throughout the Midwest in Congress, I think in the previous administration, I look back and you leverage those advocates that you have who speak on behalf of our industry and on behalf of our farmer feedstock providers. It's a little thin there now. What would you provide in terms of advice as to how these messages get to this Biden administration, particularly in 2024, when we've got key decisions being made, whether it's on the RFS and RVOs or implementation of IRA provisions? What is it that the biodiesel industry can be doing or should be doing to make sure that the administration hears those positions and those ideas?
Yeah. Let me begin this answer by saying to you, this Biden administration has done really important work in dealing with this issue of climate change. Look, there are some in the Congress. There's someone running for president who calls climate change a Chinese hoax. It is not.
Yeah.
This is real, it's serious, and it's urgent for our country. So what President Biden has done, I think, is significant. The Inflation Reduction Act and other things dealing with wind and solar and a whole series of things. Tax credits, massive new tax credits over in the Treasury, dealing with all kinds of issues. So he's done a fair amount. I should say he's done a great deal. He's done some for biofuels, but not enough. That's my point.
Yes.
And I hope what I would like to see is somehow a light bulb going on in the administration saying, you know what, we've done all these things, except we haven't done all that we can for biofuels.
Yeah.
And if we can get to that point where we've got some people over there saying, okay, let's do more for biofuels, well, I think we're going to have a good future anyway in biofuels, but it certainly will be improved dramatically if we get the White House to say, all right, here's what we need to do. Just as we're doing it with solar and wind energy and all these other issues, the EVs. Good for us for doing that, but do more. Do more with biofuels.
And I think this is a real opportunity, particularly within the marine and rail and home heat, and particularly aviation. I mean, we've seen, low carbon aviation fuels are almost as shiny of an object as electric vehicles are with some in this town. Do you think that's a good path to pursue? Is developing out, maybe building these coalitions with kind of non-traditional transportation players in rail and marine and aviation? Will them coming to the table, making the argument on our behalf that they need more low carbon biofuels, is that a path to success in your mind?
I think it is. It's potentially a very big market, and it's a market that I don't think the administration or anyone really knows quite how to solve at this point with biofuels. But we can get there. We need some changes in law to do it, and I think this could be a very significant new approach for biofuels with dramatic new production coming.
Yeah. So looking at the former President Trump, he used to hold these big rallies out in the Midwest and say, "I love farmers," and how a real estate mogul from Manhattan connected with Midwest farmers, I don't understand, but he did, and he brought out support among kind of rural voters, union. He got a lot of union vote that maybe Democrats had kind of locked up in the past. What's the viewpoint among the Biden administration with, kind of that electorate, that voter, the farmer, maybe the rural voter that used to be with the Democrats, but gravitated towards Trump? And do you think President Biden is doing enough to make inroads with that group?
I wish that there's an answer to that question that I was able to articulate quickly. There's not. I was elected in North Dakota. I was elected statewide 11 times as a Democrat. Now that is not happening in North Dakota, as you
That's
know.
right.
But, the question back in North Dakota then was, do they know you? Do they trust you? Do they like you? If the answer is all three of those, yes, they
You
don't
had a
care
pretty good
much
shot.
which party you're from. It has become much, much more tribal and much more Trump than it ever existed before. And it's just hard for people to leave what they perceive to be their political party. Although I must say, and again, this is controversial, but I have a microphone anyway. I must say that the Republican Party now is not the conservative Republican Party that I knew and deeply respected, because I think conservatism, political conservatism, has a very important place in this country. Democrats want to spend a lot,
Right.
in terms Republicans always played a significant role in saying, yes, we agree with these things, but we have a different way of reaching them.
Sure.
So I think, the Republican Party has left a lot of Republicans and gone to someplace else. I'd like to get back to a different kind of political circumstance.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So, let's look at 2024. We talked a little bit about some of the priorities. For the biofuels industry, we don't have an RVO coming that would set volumes for us, although the statute would require it. But we do have important tax provisions that were in Inflation Reduction Act that perhaps we could amend or extend. What's your view of the political achievement list that we'll be looking back on in December of 24? What did this Congress accomplish in calendar year 2024, looking into your crystal ball?
Well, either the Congress or the administration. I don't know that the Congress is going to accomplish a lot of things that would require both parties to agree. Even in the Senate, it takes 60 votes to do almost anything, as you know. And so there's going to have to be agreement. The immigration, for example, is an example. They really need to do immigration to the extent they can. Senator Langford, Senator Murphy, and others are working hard on it. I don't know whether it's going to work or not, but even now there's some pushback saying we don't intend to pass an immigration bill during this administration. So we'll see. My hope is that we can see some progress in changing the law with respect to tax credits and other things that relate to biofuels. My hope is that we can change the law that relates to the Clean Air Act, so that we can, in that Clean Air Act, deal with the issue of seagoing vessels and,
Sure.
and other things, because that could be a significant new market for our biofuels.
Absolutely. Farm Bill has been extended through September of 2024. There's some talk of momentum maybe picking up once we get past the government funding deadlines here in March. What's your expectation? I know that I think there have been one or two farm bills that have been enacted in the presidential election year as late as June or July.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see any momentum or any of the items lining up that would need to kind of get a farm bill across the finish line by summertime?
There's a chance that it can get done, but it's more likely that it may not get done and it may get extended again. And the reason for that is, again, the issue of compromise. You've got some issues that are controversial and difficult. And there are nutrition issues, as you know, that are significant that are in the Farm Bill. And so there's, my best guess is that we probably will not see much progress in the Farm Bill. Don't know that for sure. I hope I'm wrong. Same is true with the FAA bill. At one point I chaired the subcommittee on commerce that was dealing with aviation. We had a very difficult time dealing with the FAA bill. It's even more difficult now. So we may have a farm bill and an FAA bill in which there's not much progress this year.
Yeah. Well, as we head into the 2024 elections, we talked a little bit about the presidential race. Let's talk about Congress. What's your expectation? I mean, both are essentially evenly divided. A majority of 219 for the Republicans in the House and 51 in the Senate for Democrats. I think the conventional wisdom here in Washington is that it's kind of teed up for maybe the House to flip to Democrats and maybe the Senate to flip to Republicans. What are your thoughts on that?
It'll be interesting to me to see what kind of influence exists in this election with respect to reproductive freedom.
Sure.
Because abortion has played a significant role in the last two House elections. It just has.
It brought out a lot of Democrat support. That's right.
And they're not interested in compromising on the question of reproductive freedom. They're just not. And so we'll see whether that plays a role. My best sense is that the House probably can or will become Democratic, and it is much more difficult to retain a Democratic Senate. The other point to make is that we will always have enough people running for House and Senate offices. The question is, do we have the right people who really want to run for the House and Senate, who have the capability and have the strength and the elegance and so on that you want people in politics to have? Maybe elegance is a wrong word, but my point is there are a lot of people leaving the Congress these days.
A lot of retirements.
A lot of retirements.
Yes.
And I think the reason is if you find nourishment in accomplishment, you're starving.
Yes.
There's no accomplishment.
That's a great way
and
to
so
put
you
it.
can't feel nourished about not getting done what you go through elections and they are difficult, and you get here, you win, and all of a sudden you discover, hell, I can't accomplish anything.
Yeah.
So that's why we have people leaving, I think.
A great example of that is when you see members who've been around long enough to now have seniority to gain a gavel and they're retiring. It blows my mind. I can't fathom a situation where you've spent 15 or 20 years to build up that seniority to have the gavel, only to say, you know what, this place isn't for me anymore.
And there's some good people that are leaving, and I think it's because they decided they came here for the great debate and to play a role, a constructive role in legislating, and have discovered that is not so much the case these days. Almost everything has this tight ring of politics around it.
Yeah.
And so we'll see.
Who did you enjoy working across the aisle with the most? Do you remember kind of?
Oh yeah, I mean, I worked with Domenici a lot. Pete Domenici was Mr. Energy.
Yeah. And
the interesting thing is that this wouldn't happen today, but I can remember the day Pete came to see me in my office, and he said, "Look, Byron, you're a senior guy on the Energy Committee. I'm chairing it," and he said, "I want to know what you need in an energy bill. You tell me, as we're going to write a new energy bill, I want to hear from you what you think you need in that bill." So I said, here are the things that are important to me. And then he left. And I think he went to, most other offices.
Did the same thing.
And did the same thing. And then he discovered, all right, here's the way I can put together a bill that has support from Republicans and Democrats.
Yeah.
What a good thing to do. It's the way it used to work in the Congress.
Yeah.
It doesn't work that way now.
And Senator Domenici was a great human being.
He was a terrific man and smart and very capable.
Yeah.
And he cared a great deal about this country and wanted to make sure he was doing things that strengthened our country. We have such a big economic engine in this. I mean, there's no economy like the American economy, but this engine runs on a lot of fuel and a lot of energy. And so Pete played a key role in that for a very long time.
He did. This is way off topic, but one of my favorite speeches on the Senate floor included former Senator Phil Gramm from Texas telling a story about how Senator Domenici was born in a cabbage patch. His mama was picking cabbages, and he was born, and that afternoon she went back to picking cabbages. I have no idea where Phil Gramm came up with that story, but to hear Phil Gramm in his Southern accent tell that story was fantastic. Hey, before we wrap up here, I got a couple of questions for you. If you weren't in elected office, what would you have done with your career? What would your occupation have been?
Don't know for sure. I discovered later in life I was a pretty good writer. I've written 5 books. I'm now working on a 6th.
Okay.
And so and I shouldn't even say it this way.
Plug the book. Let's plug the book.
Well, no, this one. But my first book made the New York Times bestseller list, and so that gave me a notion that I was able to do some of these things. I don't know. I went to get an MBA degree, and I was going to be in business.
Yep.
And I thought I would be a businessman. My dad was, we raised horses and some cattle, but he was also a businessman. And so that's what I thought my future would be. And through a whole series of strange accidents and strange happenings, I ended up in politics for most of my adult life.
Turned it into a pretty good career.
Well, it did, and I felt very strongly about this. I love this country. I felt very strongly about being able to play a role, even from a tiny little town in the southwest corner of North Dakota, out near the Badlands. I was able to end up with a desk in Washington, D.C., where when I pulled the drawer out, I saw Harry Truman sat in that desk once.
Is that right?
Yeah, and I felt, you know,
That's
you get kind of get the
impactful,
chills.
yes.
Yeah, so
Yes.
I was enormously proud of the ability to serve.
That's fantastic. Well, I'm not going to assert that you're of retirement age, but my final question is going to be, if you never had to work another day in your life, what would Byron Dorgan do with himself? Well, what do you like to enjoy
Well, it
doing?
used to be tennis and skiing.
Okay.
I loved to ski. And, used to ski a lot. Don't ski much anymore, but I loved it. And tennis, I played tennis all my life. And so if I could play tennis and ski, but, I'm not the young skiing age anymore. But anyway, I don't know. I just, life is, my discussion with virtually every student group I've ever talked to is, whenever an opportunity exists, always say yes.
Yeah.
Right?
That's a great point. I remember following Senator Grassi when he would do, there was probably no group that he loved talking to more than walking into a high school or elementary school and taking questions from young folks.
Yep.
Just enjoyed it. So,
Absolutely.
Well, listen, I want to thank you for joining us here, Senator Dorgan. Glad to have you. Thanks for sitting down with us.
Oh, this was fun. Thanks a lot, Kurt.
You got it. And thank you for listening. Be sure to rate and review us wherever you listen to podcasts, and join us next week for another episode of the Better, Cleaner, Now podcast.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. To catch all the latest from Clean Fuels Alliance America, follow us at cleanfuels.org. The Better, Cleaner, Now podcast is a production of Clean Fuels Alliance America. That's all for us. Now it's your turn to be better, cleaner, now.